Okay, I guess we can start. Welcome to today's seminar. The title is RCT, a method for education policy research. And what we'll be talking about is RCTs in education research and how authorities can use research based on this method for policymaking. My name is Astrid Sandsør, and I'm an economist and also a researcher here at NIFU. You'll hear from my colleagues as well, Robin Ulriksen, who's an educational researcher, and Martin Flate, who's also an economist. We will share our experiences with developing and implementing 3 RCTs in the field of education. In addition, we're happy to welcome researchers from RAND Europe, Julie Belanger and Alex Sutherland, who will bring us some lessons learned from implementing RCTs in England. So what are RCTs and what kind of questions can they answer? As researchers, we often seek to answer causal questions. What is the effect of a policy? So if we see a change in outcomes after a policy is introduced, how certain are we that the changes are caused by the policy itself? In education, we might, for instance, want to ask, what is the effect of reducing class size? Do smaller classes cause an increase in learning? So to the left here, we see a classroom with about 9 students, and to the right, a classroom with about 50 students. Now, what if we give them both a standardized test, and we see that the students in the large classroom do better than the students in the small classroom? Does this mean that it's better to be in a large classroom than a small classroom? And this is actually a common finding in the literature. Children in smaller classes tend to do worse on tests than children in larger classes. And this happens even if we control for parental education and other variables that are relevant. So is this then evidence that large classes are bad for students? Not necessarily. We have a problem with these types of studies because they suffer from endogeneity. They're non-experimental. And these cause 2 common problems. The first of them is what we would call the reverse causality problem. We can say that larger classes, can we say that larger classes are better for students? Or is it in fact that better students are placed in larger classes? So what are we actually picking up? The second problem is what we call the problem of omitted variables. If there are variables that could explain why better students are in the larger classes that were not including in the analysis, then we're not getting at the correct estimate of the effect of class size. One such variable could be if there are disruptive students. If such students tend to be placed in smaller classes, then we might be picking up the effect of being disruptive or having disruptive classmates rather than the effect of being in a smaller class. So these types of problems, they make causal inference difficult. And as long as we can't control for the potentially omitted variables or solve the problem of reverse causality, we can't know if we're capturing the effect of class size. And so making a recommendation based on the finding that these students in the large class do better on tests than the student in the small class would probably be a bad recommendation. So what we do then is we look for the perfect, well, how can we give a good recommendation on policy, for policymakers, and how can we know that the change we see in the outcomes is caused by the policy? Well, in searching for causality, we can do something, we can look for, we like to imagine the perfect experiment. And what would the perfect experiment be? Well, if we go back to this classroom example, what if you were able to place me both in the little classroom and in the small classroom? And then you could give me the same test in both these cases. And then since I'm the same person and the only difference is the fact that I'm placed in a small and a large classroom, then the difference in my test scores, we could say, is the effect of being in a small classroom. However, you obviously can never observe the same person in 2 different states. So what we say is that we can never directly observe the counterfactual, what the situation would have been if I was in a large class instead of a small class. So therefore, we try to do the next best thing. And that's where the RCT comes in, the randomized controlled trial. So if we're interested in the effect of small classes, and we have a group of students, what we can do is something we call random assignment. So we randomly place some of these students into the treatment group, and we randomly place the other students into the comparison group or the control group. Now, if the groups that we randomize are large enough, they should on average be comparable to each other. That is to say that in the treatment group, you should on average have the same parental education, gender, intelligence, motivation, disruptive students, and so on as the students in the comparison group. So then we could, for instance, have 2 teachers teaching the treatment group, and they would get smaller classes. And then we would only have 1 teacher in the comparison group, and that would have a larger class. And then that would be the only difference between them. They should on average be comparable, but we're giving some of them smaller classes and the other group the regular sized class. So then what do we do? Well, we could give the treatment groups a test after they've been taught in the small classes, and we can see maybe that on that test there are a lot of students that gain knowledge. And then we can give the same test to the comparison group, and also here we see that some students have gained knowledge, but maybe not as many. Now, if we have enough students, then we can start to talk about whether this difference is significant, whether it actually is the case that the treatment group has learned more than the comparison group. One of the most famous experiments in education is the Tennessee STAR experiment, which actually did this type of randomization for class size. So they had 11,000 students in 80 schools that were randomized to one of 3 treatments, either a small class, or a regular sized class, or a regular sized class together with a full-time aide. And they did find significant effects of reducing class size. So to sum up, randomized controlled trials, people who have access to the program are selected randomly. So the people that end up in the treatment group, that has to happen in a random way so that we can ensure that the groups are comparable. So this ensures that there's no systematic difference between those who receive the program, which we call the treatment group, and those who serve as a comparison group or a control group. And this means that both the observable characteristics will be the same across groups on average, such as family background, but also that the unobservable characteristics, like motivation and talent, will be balanced across the groups. So on average, treatment and comparison groups are comparable when the program starts. And this means that we can assume that they would have followed the same development in the absence of program. So any change we then pick up after the program has happened, we can attribute to the program itself and not any other underlying variables. And then comparing those outcomes of those 2 groups, they give us the causal effect of treatment. So what can we learn from RCTs? Well, the strength of this method gives us really good evidence of a causal impact. And also we can answer very specific questions. So if we have something that we want to figure out because the field is uncertain about it, or we don't know how large the effect usually is, or we're unsure about what component of a program specifically is what's causing an effect, then we can create an RCT where we're starting off and asking the very specific question we want to answer, and we design it in a way that we get an answer to that question. A lot of times we can get good causal effects from quasi-experimental studies as well, but then you don't have that same influence on the question necessarily. And once you have a causal estimate, be it from RCTs or from quasi-experimental studies, then you can do cost-benefit analysis. You can see how much effect did I get and how much did it cost me. And then when you know those 2 things, then you can compare policies. You can see which policy should I introduce if I want the most learning for my dollar. And because RCTs give such a good causal impact, they contribute to the field of knowledge in a very meaningful way. So one RCT might not be enough to state that reducing class size is a good policy for all, but then if you combine the knowledge from RCTs with quasi-experimental studies and other RCTs in other contexts, then we start to get a richer picture both of when it works and when it doesn't work and what type of context it works in. And all of this gives really valuable information to policymakers. And then the last thing I want to add here is that designing and carrying out an RCT, it increases the knowledge both among researchers and stakeholders beyond the questions answered by the RCT. So in designing and carrying out an RCT, we're really interested in that final estimate where we compare the outcome of the treatment and the control group. But in the process of getting there, we're in schools, we're talking to teachers, we're communicating with school leaders, we're doing all of this work in the field that brings up new research questions. And questionnaires are helping us figure out what does it seem to be, which parts of the program are working here. And that gives us new ideas for new RCTs and so on. But of course we have to realize that there are limitations with RCTs as well. They're not the solution to everything. The obvious limitation is that they're expensive, they're time consuming, they're not always practical to carry out, and sometimes there's also ethical concerns about some groups getting something that other groups aren't getting. And when it comes to treatment, the fact that people are a part of an experiment can actually change their behavior. If the treatment group changes their behavior because they know they're being treated, we call it the Hawthorne Effect. So what would be an example of that with class size research? Well, we might think that the teachers know that if we find a significant effect of reduced class size, that could influence their workload for all time into the future. Those teachers might work harder than they otherwise would have when they know that they have a small class to prove that small classes are better. In that case, we're picking up the effect of teachers working harder, not smaller classes. But the other effect, the John Henry effect, is when the comparison group changes their behavior because they know they're in the comparison group. They might be jealous that they're not getting the treatment and they might slack off, or they might want to prove that they could do it well even though they didn't get whatever the program was, and they might work harder than they otherwise would have. So those two types of effects we have to be concerned about. In addition, RCTs, they usually don't answer general equilibrium effects. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if we're studying class size and we reduce class size, we might get an answer to the question, what happens if you reduce class size, given that we have the teachers to teach these classes? But if you implement that policy at a national level, you have to be extremely concerned about where those teachers are coming from. Do you have enough teachers to teach these smaller classes? And if by increasing the number of teachers you need, you're actually reducing the quality of the teachers, then there's two effects that might go in the opposite direction. You might not get that expected increase in learning from smaller classes. And then we also have to be concerned with the generalizability of the experiment. Can the program be replicated? Do we use so high quality researchers in implementing the program that it's unrealistic to expect those type of effects in another setting where less qualified people have to carry out the program? Will the results be the same if we do the experiment with a different population, older students, younger students, a different country? And what if we've implemented a sort of complex program that has many sides to it? Would the effect be the same if the program was slightly different? Do we know which part of the program is what caused the effect? So all of these questions are things we have to think about. So today's seminar, we're going to go through 3 RCTs. First, Robin Ulriksen is going to talk about planning for an intervention about absenteeism in Northern Norway. Then Martin Flatø is going to talk about optimal research design in a project called A Team Around the Student. I'll talk about the 1+1 project, where we're in the process of implementing the project and collecting data. And then we'll hear from Julie Belanger and Alex Sutherland, who will talk about lessons from England. And finally, we'll open up for a discussion.
Thank you, Astrid. Yes. Well, we are just starting. We have thought of this a long time, but we're just starting on a project now in Northern Norway, in the counties in Northern Norway, looking at absenteeism. Me and Astrid, who who are in this project, we were talking about, or we were we were enlightened by the problem, the obvious problem that the Ministry of Education and Research in Norway have established a new non-attendance rule in upper secondary school, where students who have where the non-attendance limits are 10% for receiving a grade. This means that the students the school will have the consequence of having a high non-attendance will be that students might will problems completing upper secondary school. The non-attendance limit that is set, you have also, the school can do individual evaluations up to 15%, but above 15% the school has to abide to the new regulation. This is non-documented absence. So if you have a documented absence, this documented absence will not count into the 10%. What was obvious for me and Astrid was that this is a new regulation, but the new regulation do not have guidelines in how to reduce or prevent high absence. So me and Astrid thought that, well, this is something that we know the school needs. They need some knowledge, and they need also some idea of how to reduce and prevent high absence. So we took the trip we called the counties in Northern Norway. Being from Northern Norway, we were we knew some of the local problems and the regional problems in Northern Norway. So we thought that this was a project that's kind of suited for Northern Norway. We took the trip up to Northern Norway, talked to the 3 counties in Northern Norway. We talked a bit on the non-attendance variation in the counties. So as you see, some counties have above national average non-attendance, but you have also one of the counties who has below the national average. So you have a variation in the counties itself. However, you also have the northern counties in Norway also have a problem in completion in upper secondary school. So as you know, non-attendance might lead to non-completion, and the counties in Northern Norway wanted to also to do something about non-completion also. So the Northern County agreed to participate in this project. So what we did, we made a timeline, and we applied for some national funding. We got the national funding, and the timeline in our project, as you see, we start in the project now this spring 2017. We will, this autumn, we will map some of the absenteeism in Northern Norway, the counties. We will prepare and complete an interview of some students in Northern Norway and teachers. We will implement a program autumn next year, and we will have a school survey at the end of the school year 2018. And we will look at both survey and register data to look at the effect of the intervention. It's expected to end autumn 2019. Well, what I'm going to talk a bit about is how we go about to find the best possible program in this project. What we first had to think about is to communicate to the counties and the school what an RCT is, because it implies that in our case that only half of the school will receive a program, while the other half will not receive a program. So we have to prepare the schools and the counties for that. They have to accept it. They did, surprisingly, without any arguments. And we had also to explain to them that, well, we used prior research in designing what we believe might be the causes for high absence. But this model we want to apply to look if it suit the students in Northern Norway. What we are just trying to get now is some data from the counties in Northern Norway to map the absence in northern Norway. And what we are obviously concerned about is the variation in the counties themselves, but also in the school programs. We're also looking if the variation also concerned to the schools. And also if some of the problems are the descending school, the secondary school. We are looking at variation also in gender, of course, and we are also interested in looking at if the problem kind of manifests itself in secondary school. So does low grades and high absence in secondary school count for some of the absence in upper secondary school? We are also now preparing interviews, and we've decided to have we have a contact teacher in each school. That will kind of help us in establishing both the project, but also now in the first round, we want them to pick out the students and the teacher for us. So we are now also trying to create a description of which students we want to talk to. And we, of course, are interested in having getting to know the different reasons for high absence. But we wanted to know the reason for high not documented absence. So this is a description we have to make to the contact teacher to select the right students for us. We are also what we are also interested in is capturing the variance in causes of high absence. But also, of course, making a program, you have to kind of end out in something that you believe is common for these causes. So preparing the interview guide, we are interested in both what is kind of what do we know about high absence, and are there local problems that we have to kind of look into, take into account when we create the program. So finding the right program, we target different forms of absence. Of course, different reasons for absence, but we also want to target different participants, and the program had to kind of apply both to regional and local programs in high absence. There also a challenge is to find something that's unique, something that the schools don't do now, so that we can do something that is something we can measure in the later. This is the model we use when we are when we started this project, and it kind of just shows that it's undocumented absence we are interested in preventing, and it's student motivated absence we are interested in targeting. So we are trying to target students motivated undocumented absence, but there are different reasons for that. And this, the literature kind of points to different sources for having high absence, different reasons why students have high absence. However, we also go into when we are going in to interview the students, we are also kind of course, interested in there might be other reasons than what we find in the literature. So that is why we are interested in talking to the students before creating the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah. So the way we're going to run this, we have now 3 short presentations from Norway, and then USB talk, and then we will have the discussion. So please say if you have good questions for Robin or any of us for that discussion. So I'm going to talk about the next stage. So how do we work out an optimal research design when we want to do an RCT, and I'm going to talk about that based on experiences from a team around the student, which is a recent RCT that NIFU is leading in collaboration with the Institute of Public Health and the Center for Learning Environment. This is a project funded by the Directorate of Education. And the main message from my talk is going to be that a well-founded RCT requires detailed planning, and perhaps much more so than other research methods. The reason for this is that with an RCT, it's sort of all about the design that you put into it at the very planning phase, and in this phase it's then very important to have that collaboration between the funder and the researchers, and the tight collaboration, because many of the decisions about an RCT have to be made in this very early phase. And to illustrate why this is a need, I often tend to look at this diagram. So here across we have whether an intervention actually had the expected impact or not, and then down we have the conclusion of the study, so whether we conclude that intervention worked or not. And where we want to be in this diagram at the end of the study is in this diagonal. So if the intervention did not have the expected impact, we want to conclude that it didn't work, there's a zero finding. And if it had the expected impact, we want to conclude that it worked. What we want to avoid is sort of being in this upper left corner here, where the intervention had the expected impact, but we conclude that the intervention did not work. And that can easily happen if the sample size is too small. On the other hand, it's also important to limit the sample size, because having a very large sample can be very costly. And that's why at the very beginning of an RCT, before we start with the intervention, there's a need to do a power analysis to estimate the sort of optimal sample size. Even worse is to end up in this bottom right corner, where the intervention did not have the expected impact, but we conclude that it worked. This might mean that you then upscale a useless program, which can be very expensive and even harmful. And so we want to avoid being in that corner. And if you have many outcomes, and then at the end of the study, you sort of look at all your outcomes, and then you cherry pick only the outcomes where you had positive results, then there's an increased risk of ending up in this corner. And that's why there's a need to sort of clearly state the hypothesis that you're going to test before we start the RCT. And this is usually codified in a protocol. So I will now go through how we've solved these two issues, how we've done a power calculation and decided upon the hypothesis for this study. So first, briefly about the team around the student. There was a call by the Directorate of Education for studies on the effects of multidisciplinary professions in 5th to 7th grade on learning environment and on learning outcomes. And this was based on a literature review which identified 5 models of multidisciplinary professions, where the school nurse model was one of those. And NIFU, in collaboration with partners, then designed an RCT on the effect of an extra school nurse resource. And specifically in this project, we will deploy a 50% extra school nurse position for 2 years in each of 15 municipalities. And they are going to work on the 5th to 7th graders in 4 schools. And we say that they're going to work in a systemic and structured collaboration with the school. And with systemic, we mean that the school nurse should work with the whole school and the healthcare system to promote sort of a healthy psychosocial environment for all, rather than only targeting individual students in need. With structured collaboration, we mean that there's a plan for regular meetings between teachers and school administration and school nurse, and that the headmaster has a responsibility for this collaboration. So that's the intervention. And then already in the planning phase, in the application phase, we did a power calculation to determine how many schools do we need, how many municipalities do we need for this study. And the first decision that has to be made is then the level of randomization. Should you randomize individuals, classrooms, or schools? And since the school nurses are going to work systemically, we need to randomize at the school level. But could we randomize at an individual or classroom level? We could have kept a smaller sample, which might be the case in some other RCTs. Then we need a number of parameters. So we need a minimal detectable effect size, and this should ideally be based on prior RCTs on a pilot, and this is set to 0.2 standard deviations in this project. We need a likelihood of detecting an effect and the significance level that we're after, and these are usually set to 80% and 5%. Then there's the intra-cluster correlation. That's the share of the total variance which is within the schools. And this is estimated based on prior data. So we had some data from the Norwegian pupil survey and estimated this ICC on two outcomes, a sort of culture for learning and well-being outcome. Then we also need the average number of students per school and the average number of schools per municipality. And with this information, we can make this graph here. On the y-axis, you have the minimum detectable effect size, and then on the x-axis, the number of municipalities. And we estimated that we needed a minimum of 11 municipalities in the study. And so we sent out the invitation to 31 municipalities, that were all the eligible municipalities. These had to have at least 8 schools with 20 target students or more, and not be involved in RCTs with the same target population. So we recruited 16 municipalities and have 15 who have signed contracts. After the application phase, we went into a second planning phase where we are now, and where we're writing a protocol. So a protocol, it commits the project to a set of hypotheses, and it defines the randomization method and the outcome variables, and how the results will be analyzed. For the learning environment, we're thinking of operationalizing that in 4 primary outcomes. Some internationally validated batteries of self-assessed learning environment, which are well-being and school belonging and bullying, and then we have student absence. And then the national test scores will be a very important secondary outcome, and we also monitor school nurse time usage, teacher perceptions, and we have qualitative interviews connected to the RCT to sort of better understand the outcomes. Now, we could think of many more hypotheses that would be interesting to test in this RCT. However, we need to limit ourselves to a few hypotheses. And the reason is that testing more hypotheses is very costly. You need to adjust the significance levels to this increased risk of a type 1 error. Also in the protocol, we state the randomization method. So in this case, we did a stratified randomization. And that means that schools in different municipalities were put in different baskets or strata. And then also within each municipality, we divide the schools in 2 strata based on levels of well-being and bullying in 2016. And then 2 schools are drawn in each stratum to receive the nursery resource, and the remaining schools are followed as control schools. Now, the stratified randomization. It ensures a better balance between the control and treatment groups and thus make it easier to find significant effects. So some experiences from this project. So first of all, designing an RCT is quite demanding, and a successful element of a team around the student so far is that we've had sufficient allocation of time and resources in excellent collaboration with the Directorate of Education. So we had 5 months from the call went out until pre-qualification. In this period, we designed the intervention, we did the power analysis and the application. And then we had 3 more months to finalize the application, and there was some cost recovery for projects that pre-qualified. And then from the decision was made until the nurses start working, we've had 8 months. In those months, we've had meetings with all municipalities, we've piloted questionnaires, and we've had in-depth interviews in 2 municipalities, and we're writing this protocol. Also crucially, the municipalities have to hire these nurses in this time. Another message to take home is that the problem statements for an RCT should always have few primary outcomes of interest, and this is quite demanding on both the researchers and the funders to sort of narrow down the sort of core aim of an RCT, and then additional hypotheses may of course be included as secondary outcomes. And it's also often a good idea to have this extensive qualitative research program coupled with the RCT to better understand the mechanisms that determine the success criteria. So that's it from me. Here's a picture from one of the meetings in the municipality with school nurses and administration and headmasters, and you can find more on our webpage as well.
Okay, so the next project I'm going to talk about is implementing and data collection experiences from the 1+1 project. This project is a project that NIFU is leading in cooperation with SØF at NTNU and Institute for Samfunnsforskning in Oslo. And here at NIFU, the people working on the project are Vibeke Oppheim, Esther Rønsen, Kari Salvanes, myself, and Jørgen Sjåstad. So what do we do in this project? Well, the question we're asking in the 1+1 project is, does small group instruction improve students' skills in mathematics? And the participating municipalities, we have 10 participating municipalities spread all over the country. You see them with the red circles there. Asker, Bærum, Bodø, Drammen, Sandefjord, Sarpsborg, Stavanger, Trondheim, Tromsø, and Ålesund. And in these municipalities, we have a total of 160 schools, where 80 of the schools are in the treatment group and 80 of the schools are in the comparison group. And we have a stratified randomization, like Martin talked about, within the municipality. What do the treatment schools get in this case? Well, they get 1 additional teacher or 1 additional full-time position. And what do we ask them to do with this teacher? Well, we say that this teacher should be used to provide small group instruction in mathematics. This is an intervention that targets all students in the classroom, not just the low-performing or the high-performing. So all students should at some point receive small group instruction. And we use what we call a pull-out strategy, which is that you have a small group of 4 to 6 students, which should receive a minimum of 3 sessions per week for a duration of 4 to 6 weeks, before they're then placed back into regular classroom instruction in mathematics. And this should happen 2 times a year. So the students should be experiencing a minimum of 8 weeks of small group instruction during the school year, and this is equivalent to about 1,000 minutes of small group instruction. Now the organization of the group, the project recommends that these small groups that are taken out of regular instruction be homogeneous, but we only suggest that the schools themselves can decide the composition of the group. And in this project, it's very an important aspect is the teacher collaboration. The new teacher that's brought into the project to teach these small groups has to collaborate with the main classroom teachers because what goes on in the main classroom where they're learning mathematics and in the small groups should be covering the same topics, but maybe using the fact that they have a smaller group, they can go into the topic in a different way. Or because they have high-performing or low-performing students, they can approach the topic in a different way than what they would do in the regular classroom. The way the project works is that we started last year in the school year 16-17 with the students in grade 2 and 3 receiving small group instruction. Now this year, students in grade 3 and 4, so the same students, will be receiving small group instruction again. Then next year, we'll follow that one group for one more year, and we'll start small group instruction in grade 2 for a new cohort. And then the last year we'll follow those up in grade 3 and have a new cohort for only grade 4. Now this gives us some variation in the length of how long they've had small group instruction, also which age they were exposed to small group instruction, which might help us figure out when it's efficient to start small group instruction and how long there might be some differences in having it just 1 year or having it many years. So I just made a small figure on the side, so we have that classroom, and we're taking a small group of similar students, most likely out of the classroom, and then the regular teachers then left with the remaining students to teach them mathematics. So there's one full-time position per schools. A lot of schools have divided it into two 50% positions, and what that teacher should do is, of course, the small group instruction, also reporting to the project about how the instruction is being carried out, and planning and cooperating with the other teachers that are teaching the main classes. And an important part of this reporting to the project is registration of small group instruction. So they have to fill in these electronic registration forms, and they give us information per day on which students are receiving small group instruction, the length of instruction, the group size, and the group composition. And so we get these reports monthly. All schools, so both the treatment and the control schools, are participating in tests in mathematics. Now we've developed a pre-test in the project, which we consider to be a pedagogical tool for the teachers. They can use that to see how their students are performing in mathematics, and possibly use that also to select the students that are supposed to be in the same group for small group instruction. And it's an electronic test that they take on a pad or computer. And then the project has also developed a post-test for grades 2 and 3. And then for the post-test for students at level 4, we wait until the fall, where they take the national test in numeracy. Now the advantage of this test is that all students are included in this test, and we're less worried about missing data. One of the drawbacks is, of course, we have to wait until they reach 5th grade, so it takes a while to get there. And then in addition, we ask that all the schools participate by taking questionnaires that are given to the teachers and questionnaires that are given to the school leaders, so we can learn more about what's going on at the schools. So what are the challenges in this project? Well, when you get to this stage, so we've already done what Martin was talking about and planned the project, and then suddenly the reality hits you that you're trying to implement this in the best way possible. Now, one of the problems you're always going to deal with is, how do you get the schools to implement the treatment in the way that you want them to implement it? Well, this project is based on contact through the school owners, and in this case the municipalities. So we want the municipalities to communicate to the schools in their municipality who are part of the project on how the project should be carried out, how the test should be implemented, and so on. All this information should go through the school owners. Well, it turns out that that's not sufficient. We need to go in and talk to the school leaders themselves, and often also the teachers themselves. And so the information work that's needed and the hours needed to communicate is a lot more than what we imagined. And we're also seeing this clearly after the first year of the project, because we can see that the information and the data from the schools that we're getting varies depending on who the school owner is. So there's difference there with how much they use the structure down to get the schools to do what we need them to do. And so then we need to go a level down and communicate more at the school level. So this, like I mentioned, is very time consuming. But then again, we have this help in the registration forms that we have the teachers fill out, because as we're getting these reports monthly, we can actually see at an early stage that it doesn't look like the students are receiving the instruction they should be receiving here. It looks like a school is having a too large group or a too small group, or they're not having enough instruction, the instruction time is too little. We can investigate these things as the project is being carried out. In addition, we have the questionnaires that we carry out yearly, which we then can, at the end of the year, see if there's some factors that we should be picking up on that we haven't picked up on yet. So just from our first year of these registration forms, we can, for instance, see how many minutes each student has had small group instruction. If they follow our setup, they should have, like I mentioned, have about 1,000 minutes of small group instruction, and we see that quite a few students don't have that much. Now this could be that it's just the first year of the program. It could be, we're hoping that that will increase, but then we can go in and we can see which schools, whether it's systematic, which schools that's happening for. But then we see that, for instance, the group size, we want them to be 4 to 6 students. Here it seems to be going quite well. They are, in fact, taking out 4 to 6 students into small group instruction. So another problem we have, which is the problem of selection. We need informed and written consent in order to merge data. So we don't need consent in order for them to take the test, but we need consent in order for the tests to be merged with the other tests. Now, 4 cohorts at 160 schools means that we need about 38,000 written consent forms that need to be gathered in and scanned and everything. And this is time consuming, and of course it will affect the quality of our results. Now, this means that we're going to rely pretty heavily in the evaluation on the 5th grade test, because here we don't need that same consent. Another problem is the comparison school participation. We need the comparison schools to be part of the project. And we have the risk always that the comparison schools drop out because they're not getting anything. And we have, in fact, had one school that drops out. And that affects the whole strata of schools that school comes from. And there's a risk of low parental consent at the control schools, that they don't give consent to as large a degree as the treatment schools. We also have a risk of the selection of students completing the test. There might be different students that complete the test at the treatment school than at the control school. Another argument for using the 5th grade national test, where we don't have those types of problems. And then the third point here is that there's a very short time period from the project started up until the intervention had to start. And what this means is that because we had to hire the teachers for the 15-16 school year, and we wanted to randomize at the school level in order to avoid the John Henry type effects I talked about earlier, that means that we had to randomize before we could gather consent forms. So when we're asking for consent form, they already know that they're in a comparison or treatment school. It might have been easier to get consent forms before that, when they still have the hope of getting some extra resources. So if you want to read more about the 1+1 project, you can go to our webpage there, and we have some information. Now, before we move on, I just want to sum up a little. So policymakers, researchers, participants, we need to work together in order to create successful RCTs. We can't do it alone. So the first question is, which program should we try to implement? Well, there's no point in carrying out a huge, expensive RCT if we already know it doesn't work. So we should go to the literature and see where are the questions, what are the type of questions where there might be effects some places but not other places. If we're considering about implementing something at national level, that's definitely a time we want to go in and try to test it on a smaller sample first before we go in with huge resources. But we might be interested in what aspects of the program work, or whether it works for younger students or for older students. So we have to think closely about what questions we're going to be asking in this RCT. And we should all be aware of the common pitfalls of the RCT. When you know about the problems that can arise, you can try to address them early. So what are these types of problems? Well, you could be ignoring spillover effects, where the treatment group affects the control group, or the control group affects the treatment group. Designing an underpowered study, like Martin talked about, though you don't have enough observations to know that it actually worked, even though it did. Using unreliable outcome measures, or collecting data in a different way in the treatment and control groups. Then you're not testing the same thing in the two groups. Allowing for a high level of attrition. Attrition means that the students aren't being a part of or we aren't measuring them. We want to be able to measure the students that are a part of the project. And then failing to monitor compliance, that they're actually carrying out the treatment we've set for them, and other threats along the way. And it's very important to communicate what randomization actually means. we continue to have questions from schools who are in the control group who just want to do a little bit like that, or just want to change, or the treatment group who want to change a little bit how we're carrying out the project. So understanding that individual classes and schools will be treated differently, and they should be treated differently in the way that we've set out in the project, not in a different way that a school locally decides. And we also have to communicate that the comparison group is as important as the treatment group. At the end of the day, we need to compare those estimates with the treatment group and the control group. And if we're missing the control group, there's nothing to compare with. And then the last thing that we can all work together on is facilitating data collection. It takes a lot of time to get the right type of data, and we're pouring huge amounts of money into the implementation of the project and getting the teachers out there and carrying out small group instruction, for instance. And we need to get that data at the end of the day. That means that we can check whether it had an effect or not, and then we can all help each other in that process. So there's a book, Running Randomization Evaluations, a practical guide, which I recommend anyone to read who wants to know more about the topic. They write, we innovate and we test. The results move us forward, but also generate more questions, which again need to be answered through testing. But over time we learn, we understand more about what is working where and why, and this helps us develop better programs that lead to better lives. So hopefully RCTs in the field of education will help us improve schools and will lead to better lives.
Okay, thank you. So, let me get my slide on here.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Sure. Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody. It is so nice to see some familiar faces. I'm very, very happy to have been invited to come again. I very much enjoyed my trip last March, I think it was. So I'm happy that there seems to be quite a bit of an interest in this kind of design. And so I offered to come and share with my colleague Alex Sutherland here some of the experiences we've had now in England, because in England, about 5 or 6 years ago, they've embarked in this new adventure of trying to do a lot more RCTs than there had ever been in education. And they have a lot of lessons learned that I think that if you are embarking in this same adventure or something similar, you might benefit from learning from. So I thought today we could share some of the experiences that we have in terms of the RCTs we're involved in, but give you a bit of an idea of the model that's being used right now in terms of funding RCTs and some of the myths about RCTs that people may have. And, you know, we keep hearing about RCTs being hugely costly or expensive, but I think we want to argue the opposite, because I think the cost of not doing RCTs and of scaling up programs, hugely expensive programs that you don't even know work, is actually way more expensive than spending a little bit of money to make sure that they work before you scale them out across the country. So I guess it depends how you see that equation. So just a little bit about who we are and why we're here. So we both are researchers. We lead areas of research at RAND Europe. RAND Europe is a not-for-profit organization. It's a little bit similar to NIFU, actually. Our mission is to improve policy and decision-making through independent research and analysis. So our main office is located in Cambridge in the UK. We also have an office in Brussels in Belgium. And we are really the smaller kind of company here in Europe from the big RAND Corporation, which you might be familiar with in the US. They have 6 or 7 offices out there and a lot more researchers, which we collaborate with them quite a bit as well. So at RAND Europe, so the European side of things, we work with a lot of European governments, the Commission, European Commission in particular, but European governments more generally as well. We work with institutions, charities, foundations, universities, private sector firms. We basically provide high quality, but with a very high quality assurance process research. And we do a lot of our work in the UK, so the RCT work that we do is all in the UK at the moment, but we're keen to expand that, and we will be having meetings in Brussels with the European Commission to try to see if we can expand work more widely at a European level as well, but we work with the rest of the world, not just in Europe either as well. So we have a very multi and interdisciplinary approach to research, so we work not only with people from different teams within RAND, but also with experts outside of RAND, academics, university researchers from a wide range of different fields. So for education, the education research that we do at RAND Europe is really to try to help make educational policies, programs, and practices more efficient and effective for all. And how do we do that? Well, we evaluate the effectiveness of these policies or programs and practices. And one of the ways we do that is by using the randomized control trial method. So I'm going to stop here and let Alex walk you through some of the methods that we're using.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm in the back. Good, good. So I'm English. I get a bit excited about this stuff. If I'm talking too quickly, please let me know. I might get carried away. So just to say very quickly, I'm not an educationalist. I'm actually a criminologist and a sociologist. So if you want to know why that is, I'll tell you about it afterwards. But I've worked for about 15, 16 years in policy evaluation, primarily in youth justice in the UK, and that was almost entirely without comparison group designs. So for many years there were lots of interventions being run and evaluated with no comparison group designs, and lots of it kind of so-called evidence being produced that really doesn't tell you what you need to know. Latterly I started getting interested in quasi-experimental designs, and it's only the last few years I've started using RCTs kind of more routinely. So I'm not a randomista, that's not the only thing I can do, but I really enjoy working on them. They are really powerful and useful tools. So we'll talk a little bit, there's a little bit of repetition here with what Astrid presented earlier, but so forgive me for the repetition, but want to kind of get to the core questions, why we do these kinds of evaluations, in particular why we use randomized control trials. So the first question is, how do you know if a policy is effective? As a policy maker or a funder or researcher, we want to try and understand whether or not a policy is effective. And the flip side of this is, how do you know if it's not harming people? There's a great bit of work in criminology by a woman called Joan McCord called Cures That Harm. And she looked at interventions that actually caused harm, and they were discovered, many of them were actually evaluated with randomized trials, and it was shown that the intervention itself actually made things worse. That's the kind of question you can ask and answer. The second is, how are you measuring success? And as Astrid kind of laid out, there are many different ways of measuring things as well, and Martin mentioned as well the different outcomes you can look at. But it really focuses your mind on what you want to measure and why. What is this intervention? What is this thing, the policy change you're going to introduce? What's it going to affect? And how do you measure that well? And then how do you know it's cost effective, or even how much it actually costs? And we're looking at this cost benefit idea. You want to know how much bang you get for your buck, as the Americans say. And so, working out if you spend £1 or $1 on this intervention, how much you can save in the long term or in the short term, and thus whether it's cost effective. So Julie had a few policies you want to talk through.
Yeah, and I didn't really want to talk through these. I basically did a quick search on your kind of ministry websites and all that to look at initiatives that had been funded and rolled out in Norway. And I was curious to know if any of these had been evaluated. And I thought there's people here who might know more about this. And I guess I'm curious, how do you know that these work and that they're worth investing all the money? And you might not be familiar with these. I don't know. I just picked a few that I could through the English sections of the website to try to find things. And maybe this is something we can discuss when we get to the question period. But I think that what Alex was talking about, and Astrid and the others, is about, you have these ideas of what will work, and some of that is based on your assumptions of what works and what's worth spending money. Some of it is very political, but there's a lot of funds that go into these kinds of initiatives. Some of them go for years and years. And so I think it's important to stop and think about, okay, how do we know that these things are actually effective and are working and are not harming? And this is the point that Alex was making. They're not actually making things worse.
So then, coming back to why we use randomized control trials, and again, this is ground that's been covered, so I won't kind of repeat too much of it. I hope they're the best. It's not the best, it's the least worst way. I should change that, of determining whether a policy is working. Why? Because of the randomly assigned control group. And Astrid did a very good example and talked you through the example. the two things it does very well is control for what we call selection bias and solve this problem of attribution. How do we know it was this thing and not something else that made the change occur? And again, I won't talk through these, just an illustration of what this looks like. And there's a very good, if this is new to you or you've not really heard much about randomized control trials before, this is a very good document here, a report called Test, Learn, Adapt, Developing Public Policy with RCTs, and there's a link at the end of the slides you can look at, written essentially for policymakers by researchers to try and talk them through why they should do these things. Really what it comes down to is being able to say with some confidence what would have happened otherwise. If we didn't do this intervention, what would have happened to people that, and this is the point about observing the counterfactual. You can never really observe the same person in two places and in different situations. Unless you've seen the film Sliding Doors, it's a terrible film, don't watch it, which does precisely this. It follows the lady through the two lives, which it makes the train and one where she doesn't make the train. But that's the thing you can't do. It's impossible to do in real life. So this is what we try and do instead. And the benefits of using RCTs for policy, and this is really kind of warnings or thoughts about why you use these things, being worried about and thinking that there's a danger of being overconfident that, and just assuming that an intervention will work because it's common sense or we just know it works. One of the points I was interested in is that NIFU, you're developing interventions as well as evaluating them. So you're going to become the natives, you're going to become the developer who knows if intervention works. That's the dangers you have to manage. And there are ways of dealing with this. So having independent teams within NIFU run your outcome analysis, not letting the developers actually having the data, the outcome data, not letting them peek and see what's happening, and actually having it run independently. Because the worry is that you may be biased in your analysis. You may be biased in some way. You find out, well, it didn't work this way. Maybe if we analyze it this way, it might work. That's what you have protocols for as well. But that's just a word to the wise that you may suddenly become thinking, well, I know this works. Why doesn't it work? We can find it. I'm sure we can find the right piece of analysis. And the other point of this is that even kind of the best longitudinal research does not mean something is causal. It's very difficult to establish this, even with very good longitudinal data. And RCTs can play this very vital role in demonstrating how effective a policy is and its value for money. And really, we're talking here about policymaking and scaling up interventions, and we'll talk a little bit about the EEF model in a moment. But governments are nearly always working at a national scale. And when you start thinking nationally, the money involved is phenomenal. So really, you want to be sure that you're spending money first to understand whether something can do what it says. And this is to go to the point that Astrid, I think Martin made as well, is that RCTs are not Hulk smash. They are not this thing that can answer every single question you can think of. They're more like this. Very, very specific tool that can answer very specific questions. Different kinds of questions, maybe different topics, different substantive areas, but they can answer very specific questions. And this is the point about generalizability and about how much you can extrapolate from one RCT to another place. And this is particularly important if you're using interventions that are not developed in your country. If you're importing interventions, they may not work. It depends on where you're starting from. So the context of where your intervention takes place really does matter. So a few myths about RCTs. This is not really myths, but it's just understanding kind of motivations as to why we use it. Why do we use them? Well, we don't always know what works, as people have said. Expert intuition isn't always right. You can actually quantify the benefits very explicitly with an RCT. And if you're using a process evaluation, you can demonstrate what aspects of a program have the greatest effects. And if you're thinking about scaling up something to a national level, you can say, well, there are 10 things that we did. These 3 were the ones that are most effective. We can take those and then scale them up. The other point about this is that evidence can be contradictory, or, and that, again, Astrid mentioned this point. In the literature, you're searching for, if you have equipoise, if you have evidence that is kind of some studies say this and some studies say that, we don't really know what the effect really is. None of those studies have been randomized trials. If they had, they've been badly designed. There was a good case then for doing something as a randomized control trial. So RCTs don't have to cost a lot of money. social interventions in schools and so forth, they are, I think, normally quite expensive, but they don't have to be. Text messaging pupils to attend class, for example, that can be done very, very cheaply and at scale. In the UK, there have been studies on hundreds of thousands of people who are unemployed or seeking work, getting these kind of text message reminders, and also for tax compliance, varying how letters are sent to people that are going to be sent anyway. So something that's going to be done anyway by the government or by somebody like a municipality, you can vary that a little bit and actually then test that out as an experiment. That's going to happen anyway, so it doesn't have to be expensive. Yeah, I've already talked about this. Yeah, and as Julie mentioned, the cost of not doing an RCT, it means you just don't know whether something really is effective. So this point was raised about doing the ethics of randomized trials. And I think actually, here's one suggestion for how to present the control condition. We just call it business as usual. You know, we just say, you're just going to do what you normally do. And that seems to kind of work. Schools are quite accepting of that idea. And it's really then the trick is trying to monitor them to make sure they don't cheat and start doing things they think they look nice and buy services in that look just like the thing they haven't got. And it's also, the good thing about this kind of, this approach and these ideas is that we really don't know whether the program is effective, it has no effect, or has a negative effect. And that's one of the reasons we want to try and do these things. And the idea of denying intervention, so one ethical objection can be, well, you're denying something that could be effective, but we don't know if it's effective, and it could actually be harmful. Presented in those terms, people then, I think, are less resistant to this idea of, and it also is about fairness. We're saying you have a 50-50 chance of getting this intervention or not, and that's kind of the fairest way. It's like a coin flip, and everyone kind of, I think, understands and appreciates that. Oh yeah, one more thing I'll say on this is that sometimes you have interventions being phased in the UK. We're a big fan of phasing interventions in, and they can be national, local, whatever. And actually, if they're going to be phased in, you can then build in a trial into that. You can do it as what's called a stepped wedge design or a waiting list design, where all you're randomizing is when people actually can implement. And that's the kind of thing that policymakers, I think, like as well, because they're not doing the policy. They're just doing it in a way that allows for more rigorous assessment of results. Yeah, and so saying about this point about complicated or difficult, I think it also associated with how much it costs. So there are some simple designs, some simple interventions that don't have to be costly, that build on what people are already doing. It's always advisable to get kind of input from people who know about these things from the outset, as with any other research. And yeah, as I said, you can incorporate RCTs into a wider rollout. So I talked through test learn, yeah. So as I mentioned, there is this test, learn, adapt model that's has been used in the UK, and I won't read all the things off the slides, but it's really just saying, you have to think about your policy, identify your policies. It doesn't have to be one policy, it could be several that are variations on a theme. You can think about what outcomes you're interested in, and then how you're going to randomize. But you're walking through this process and actually thinking about these different stages. You undertake your trial, you measure the impact, you learn from that, and then you adapt the policy or change the policy based upon what you've learned. And if you need to, you go back to the start and refine and continually refine. And I'll hand over to Julie now to talk a little bit about the EEF model.
The model that Alex just presented is actually the model that the EEF uses to a certain extent. So the EEF is the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, and now I guess it's about 6-7 years ago, they were provided with a large sum of money from the Department for Education, which is our equivalent of the Ministry of Education in the UK, in England, large sum of money to basically try to reduce the achievement gap between pupils who come from disadvantaged homes and, more richer pupils. In the UK, there's a huge gap in achievement between these poor kids and richer kids. And so trying to find ways of finding interventions that would help reduce that gap. And to do that, they would fund interventions. Where do they find their interventions? All over the place. It could be researchers, it could be research organizations, or even a head teacher or a principal at a school who has an idea for an intervention, or interventions that have been done in other countries, in the US or elsewhere, that some of which have been tested, some not, at least not in the UK context. So these developers, we call them, if they have an idea, can apply for funding from the EEF, and the only kind of condition to getting this funding is that the intervention will be evaluated independently. And so this model has basically, been going for the past 6-7 years. I believe they have funded about 140 or 145 interventions so far that have all been evaluated or in the process of being evaluated over the past 6 or 7 years. So the idea behind it is that, as you say, you test an idea, then you learn from it, you change potentially the policy, but if, you've just tested it in a little bit and you figure you can improve on it a little bit, you go through the cycle again. So the EEF usually starts with a very small scale evaluation we call pilot, for example, pilot or even efficacy trials, which are much smaller scale trials than the ones that you've been describing so far that you're doing. Those would be potentially more considered as effectiveness kind of scale up type of trials. And the reason I think that this is interesting, this model, is that you get first an idea if there's some indication that there's a promising intervention there. Then you test it in ideal conditions. So you put kind of smaller number of schools, but you put everything at it, as many resources to make sure that everybody is compliant, that everything is working well. And then if you see that that seems to work, then you want to test if at a scale up, if it's going to survive the fact that every school is going to do it a little bit their own way, that there's going to be some differences in implementation, and that you're doing it at a much larger scale. And so it's that kind of cycle which I think might be good to use here in Norway as well. And what the EEF does with this is that they have an amazing website, which I think we'll maybe be able to show you later on in the presentation. Every single report is published on their website, whether it showed that the intervention worked or it didn't. So null results or even negative results are published on the website. They published these toolkits then for schools and policymakers so that they can get a sense of how the data comes together and provides practical information about what to do in their own schools if they're interested in a particular area, math or science or reading or student engagement, what have you. There's many different things. And so they're trying to really engage directly with the schools. They have, great relationship with many schools in the UK and to try to get them to take up the evidence that they're providing on their website. So really the EEF website has become a best practice type website because you can go and see and read the protocols for every single RCT, the results, the report, and then access this toolkit, all these toolkits that are practical tool. Something that's useful for researchers here is that the EEF also has guidance on how to do good evaluations for researchers and also for schools. If a school is interested in doing their own little evaluation, guidance in terms of process evaluation, what you should be following in terms of guidelines for good process evaluation, is trying to get into the black box of the implementation. Cost analysis, they have very good guidelines as well as to how do you measure how much an intervention costs so that you can then figure out, they do a per pupil cost. So every intervention comes at the end of the day with how much it costs per pupil to implement this kind of intervention. And they also have a great system a padlock system of security of findings. So once the evaluation is done, depending on the level of attrition or the quality of the outcome measures that were used or how well the design of the RCT was, you get up to 5 padlocks talking about how secure those findings are, how confident we are that these findings would happen again if you were to do this evaluation again. So that's another great indication of how to interpret the evaluation that you have in front of you. And the other thing that the website provides is the level of a number of months achievement. How many months achievement is associated with a particular intervention. So pupils who have been through this intervention perform 3 months, 4 months, 6 months ahead of the pupils who did not use this or be part of that intervention. So you get a sense of the strength of the intervention, the cost, and also the security of the finding on the website. So that's the website there. The model, the way they work really is that, as I mentioned, you have the developers. They're the ones who think about these interventions that they think will work. They have to have some kind of a logic model or a reason why they think this will work, whether it's been done before or there's some research indicating that there's some promise in this area. And they apply for funding to the EEF, so they have all these ideas of intervention. And then once the EEF sees that it's a very good idea, they will fund a particular intervention. Once that's done, they will ask for the evaluator pool. They have an evaluator of 25 different evaluation teams. We are one of those 25 teams. They put out these basically tenders of, there was just one last week with 6 new interventions. You look at them, see if there's one that you might be interested in or that you find kind of challenging or something that you find interesting. So you get your ideas for an evaluation and how you would design a trial for these ideas over here. You submit that to the EEF, and if they like your idea, then you go ahead and go and do that evaluation. So the idea is that there's a contract relationship between the funder and the developers. There's a contract relationship between the funder and the evaluators, but there's no contract relationship between the evaluator and the developer. That's independent. However, there is a lot of collaboration. So when we evaluate an intervention, we work very closely with the developers. We have a theory of change workshop. We try to understand really what the intervention is about. We together decide what types of outcome measures they feel will best capture the intervention. We provide our ideas on the process evaluation, and they even provide feedback on the protocol. So once we write our protocol, the developers get to see that and make sure that it's accurate to their understanding. But then they don't take part in the data collection or the data analysis or the report writing. All of that then comes to us. So that's a very different kind of model than what's happening here. But I think that it's a model that allows to ensure that there's no bias in the analysis and reporting later on. There's true separation there in what happens. And then it's the EEF that's in charge of disseminating and making sure that it's published. And so that's why even if there's a negative finding or no finding, the EEF will publish it because they don't have anything to lose or gain from that really. So it's the developers that could lose something in a sense if it's found that their intervention doesn't work. So we are currently running 4 trials. Well, in fact, now we're running 3 because one of them, which I'll say a few words about, or Alex will say a few words about, didn't actually end up going ahead for a very, very interesting reason that I think you could benefit from hearing from. So I thought it would be good to say a few words about that. But we are the biggest trial, so the effectiveness trial that we're running is the first one. So Alex will say a few words about that, looking at a reading program for improving reading in classrooms. The trial that didn't end up going ahead, which we're just closing off right now, is the incentive and coaching, where teachers were, it's basically incentive, it's pay for performance. So you provide teachers £4,000 at the beginning of the year on top of their salary, and depending on how well their pupils perform at the end of the year, you take back some of the money if they don't perform well. And then we have 2 other trials that are ongoing right now. The impact of teaching assistants, that one we have about, I think, 130 schools in it. It's an effectiveness trial, and another effectiveness trial is the digital feedback in primary maths using iPads in the classroom, and that one's only 30-some schools now, which we've had to change the randomization because of that. So I will let Alex say a few words about Accelerated Reader.
I was just going to see if I could show you a little bit very quickly the
website.
Yeah, the teaching and learning toolkit. If we can, yes.
It depends if the internet is
Yep.
connected.
So this is designed for. Oh, sorry. Yep. Hang on. Where's it gone?
I think you have to drag it.
Oh, okay. Let's go. There we go. Okay. So this is the teaching and learning toolkit, and it's designed so that head teachers or teachers and policymakers have an easily understandable and accessible summary of a particular intervention. And the summary really comes down to, what is it, and then they give you a quick summary, so for example, very low or no impact for moderate cost based on very limited evidence. Probably not what you want to put all your money on in that case. It shows you in terms of the cost. It's obviously on a per pupil basis, and the security of the findings. So there could have been lots of schools or pupils that did not complete outcome assessments of attrition from the study, or there could have been other problems with implementation that meant that the study really wasn't measuring what it thought it was. So they have you looking at cost and evidence strength, and you can rank these if you want, so you can actually focus on those with the strongest evidence or the lowest cost, or whatever you want to do. And then the impact, as Julie said, it's the difference in the groups in terms of their attainment progress. So the idea is this is supposed to be kind of easy access for policymakers or teachers primarily. And if you click onto these, you can then look at in more detail what the intervention was, who did the evaluation, and all the other documentation. I just wanted to show you that, and say it's worth having an explore of the website if you get a chance. Oh, there we go. Talk through all this. Wonderful. Okay, so very quickly I'll talk to you about these two trials. So Accelerated Reader is a for-profit company who run an illiteracy program, and essentially it's pushing schools to give pupils more time to read. So changing the school timetable to allow more reading time in schools. And it also gives teachers more information on how to monitor pupils' performance. So the way this works in practice is that before the kind of intervention starts, the school has to scan in to a database all the books they have in the whole school. The Accelerated Reader then ranks the books in terms of difficulty and where they are in terms of difficulty. Pupils then take a basic test that says, kind of pegs them in terms of how well they can read. And then the pupils are then encouraged and set reading that is kind of easily within their reach, and then what they call stretch reading, so reading that is just a bit harder than it was before. And the idea is that through the repetition of reading and actually just stretching the pupils to try and read stuff that's slightly harder all the time, that they improve their reading skills. And this is our largest trial at the moment, so 181 schools, about 13,000 pupils, and looking at grades 4 and 5. And we're looking at kind of a primary outcome being a reading test and then national testing towards the end of the study. Yeah, so really we want to focus on the overall reading comprehension. We're actually going to look, we have enough pupils and schools to look at the deprived pupils as a separate group, and then non-deprived pupils as a separate group, and then overall, just on all the pupils, what the effect is. And you may see quite different results. We don't know, obviously, at the moment. And the idea is that if this is successful, then it is a question about how it's scaled up. And there's a cost here. That's going to be part of the decision, obviously. This is something that schools have to pay for. And so really, it's then down to schools and kind of policymakers to think about how scalable this is. Yeah, and the design, it's a wait list plus the randomized control trial. I'm going to talk you through, you may have seen these kind of things before, just the steps in the process. So we recruited about 200 schools, we aimed to recruit about 200 schools in total. In reality, that meant approaching over 1,000 to try and get the schools we had in the end. So the target sample is all pupils in year 4 and year 5. We have a baseline assessment prior to randomization. So this is really administrative data, I think you call registry data. And we have the randomization, and then we have the control schools and intervention schools. And you'll see that it's not exactly 50-50. 92 control schools and 89 intervention schools. That's just how it happens. And sometimes you don't end up with a perfect 50-50 split. That's just what the randomization has done. So if you're doing that and it happens, don't panic. It's okay. And as I said, we refer to the control condition as business as usual, and the intervention is an accelerated reader here. Then we're doing these post-intervention tests, national testing, and then we'll also be looking at kind of on official data on school exclusion and other academic outcomes as well. Now, normally randomized control trials are talked about only as success stories. This was not a success. This did not work. I want to talk a little bit about what happened and why, and then what we can learn from it. So, as Julie mentioned, this was a trial designed to incentivize teachers through giving them additional payments at the start of the school year. And if the pupils in their class did not maintain the rank where they were in the study, then teachers would have to give back some money. And the idea, the psychological mechanism, is that humans feel losses much more than they feel gains. And you may not be surprised to hear it designed by some economists. Yeah, and so the tricky, so the idea was, you know, there's lots of noble designs on what it was going to measure and what it was going to look at, but we couldn't get enough teachers. We needed about 250 to 300 teachers to take part. We got 41. This is because there are several reasons, but the main reason we think is that it just wasn't acceptable to teachers. The intervention itself, there was a kind of a moral, ethical, professional resistance to this idea that they get extra money and then magic things happen. Because it was just you give in money and then you see what happens. So the intervention is really not the money, it's what you do afterwards once you've had the money. And there wasn't really any knowledge about what might happen, whether they just work longer hours, whether they actually change their teaching practice. So we had a challenging process evaluation planned anyway to try and capture some of this knowledge. But what we've done, you know, rather than just going, oh, right, that's it, we forget it, and then let's just forget it ever happened, we're actually writing up this piece of work for the EEF to say these are the kinds of things you might do differently with a controversial intervention like this. Test it out with teachers, talk to teachers and schools to try and see what would make it more acceptable to them, how they might be kind of convinced to make this kind of thing work. And that's very important, because often if things don't work, you just forget about them. And here they're trying to do their best to say, actually, there are still things you can learn from this kind of failure. And it's important, and particularly this idea isn't going to go away in the UK. There is a lot of interest in this kind of pay for performance. It's very controversial because teachers don't get paid very well, for one. But there's also this kind of idea that it's a calling and a profession rather than just a job that if you get paid more money, you'll do better at. So there is a lot of controversy around this. So we're trying to kind of design and think about ways of changing how these controversial interventions are approached. And really is about communication. And then the EEF has a network of what's called research schools who are kind of actively engaged in research that they can rely on to maybe approach for these kinds of questions in the future. So if there's something coming up you think, not really sure anyone's going to like that, then I would just advocate talking to as many frontline professionals as possible to see what their views are and what the arguments, the counter-arguments might be. Okay, so to summarise, and thank you for kind of maintaining your attention, so RCTs offer a way of saying whether policies and/or an intervention are effective or not. The impact of the Education Endowment Foundation is pretty much incalculable at present, but it is, and it's not kind of hyperbole, it is a revolution in educational research in the UK. Julian mentioned, I think in the 30 years prior to the EEF's existence, there was something like 10 or 15 randomised control trials that have been completed in the UK. Now there's 140. So they have really changed the education and research landscape, and they're now changing kind of how teachers think about research and how the government has to think about research. There are several hot areas that aren't just on educational outcomes. Most of the EEF trials focus on pupil attainment, but actually there's a big push now on mental health in schools, not just as teachers as well as pupils. There's a huge focus on teacher shortages, particularly in STEM, so science, technology, engineering and maths. And there's also now this work on non-educational outcomes, and that's where my criminologist hat comes in. I'm interested in the naughty kids. I want to know kind of the kids who are excluded from school. We have this silly system in the UK where if you're bad, you get sent home from school. And the kids view this as a state-sanctioned holiday, basically. We want to understand the effectiveness of that intervention and try and think about whether these interventions that are not aimed at exclusion, for example, might actually impact on exclusion or truancy. And yeah, and I think there is actually, as you're already doing, there's a lot of international evidence and learning that Norway can draw on. England is one example, but if you do want to think a bit more about what's happening in England, we'll be very happy to help you. That's it, some resources there, so thanks very much.
Okay, then we have some time for questions. I'll be bringing a microphone around. I think it's supposed to be on. Yeah. So do we have any questions right away now for any of us that have presented? Okay, I'll start off with a question then while you're thinking about your fantastic questions. I just want to hear more about how you could think of a model like this for Norway. We're a small country. We have fewer schools, fewer research teams, not necessarily the same funding opportunities. So how do you imagine this working? Like there aren't lots of evaluators and lots of ideas out there, and that combination might be hard to, so what are the important aspects of that type of model that you think we could bring into the Norwegian context?
I have a few ideas. Do you want me to use the mic? I think, yes, I think that the model is a little bit different here in the sense that you don't have the numbers for 145 trials to be running at the same time, but I think you have a big enough pool that you can definitely do a lot of at least smaller trials to begin with before, and being more selective in terms of the bigger trials that go ahead. That would be one idea. The other idea is actually a collaborative idea that I'd like to throw out there, because I know that Norway collaborates a lot with the other Nordic countries on international data sets. So I know that you have this publication that uses the PISA, TALIS data, and you have, I think it's called the Northern Lights or something like that publication, and there's a lot of collaboration across the countries on that. And I think it would be really interesting to see if we could garner a little bit of interest across the border and to look at trials that are maybe across borders. And I think that there's enough similarities and enough differences that would make those really interesting on both sides. But even, I mean, with the UK, I think with us, knowing that there's maybe some interventions that might be of interest to try to see how well they work, you know, in two different contexts, then pooling resources and getting researchers from the different countries to work together on that, it basically, you know, halves, I guess, the resources needed because we're developing all these tools together. And so I think there's some really, I think we need to think about creative ways to make it work in a smaller country, but I think it's being done. I mean, Australia is now getting into it. Some of the Southern American countries are getting into it. It's becoming, and of course in developing countries, it has been exploding through JPAL and those kinds of people as well in some very small countries. So I think it's feasible. You just, I think, have to be a little bit more creative about how you approach it in terms of collaborations, both in terms of researchers and I think government funding, but also being more selective in terms of the big trials. Don't go and fund, I think, a trial that involves 200, 300 schools until you know that you're ready for that. Do it at a small scale so that you don't then waste 200 schools on a trial that might not give you the answers that you're hoping to get. Try it with a fewer schools before, and then when you're pretty confident that there's something there that you can go ahead with, I think that that's where I would put my resources.
I've got to follow up very quickly. So my suggestion takes the opposite approach in some respects, in that for generating interventions, this could be done collaboratively with schools and local, I mean, municipalities and policymakers. You're asking for ideas to be put forward. I'm sure they have plenty of ideas that they want to tell you about, but it doesn't have to be framed as like, give us ideas to evaluate. It's tell us what's wrong, tell us what needs to change. And again, that's the kind of engagement work that helps you're doing anyway in the field, because you're doing these field trials, but actually proper engagement at the local level and finding out what issues really matter to the local policymakers as well as national is another way of generating ideas. The other thing about having a smaller pool of schools, effectively, you mentioned this already, Martin, was you know, if there are trials happening in different places, you know there's going to be overlap in terms of the population. It's being clear whether there's an overlap in the intervention and the intended outcomes, and if there's not, there may be scope then to, you know, have the same schools taking part in several trials, or use different age groups. But then it's obviously a burden on the schools, and I guess it's managing that burden. One of the things we do early on with the Education Endowment Foundation trials, when everyone starts getting excited about how many schools we need, we say, okay, what other interventions are taking place and where that might overlap with either the target population or the outcomes of interest? And that's something as well. That's something that does matter, obviously. The other thing you mentioned as well was your difference between, you've got what seemed like universal intervention, so everyone gets something at some point. And the other approach is much more targeted, which I think was mentioned in one of the other presentations. It's finding small groups of children that need additional support. Those kinds of interventions tend to be the ones that are messier and longer and harder, because you have to identify the pupils in the first place and then have to work quite intensively with them. So it's you know, you can spread your bets and do like universal interventions and targeted ones at the same time, and even overlapping in schools. And then eventually you can bring together evidence and say, okay, well, this school was taking part in 2 trials. Kind of what's happening to the kids in this school? Oh, is there kind of interference or contamination between the trial interventions, or just maybe they're just much more engaged with what we're trying to do. So there are all these tricky questions that will come out, but I think there are ways of steering around it for the time being. I'll shut up.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for great presentations. My question is for both Astrid and Martin, and it concerns whether intervention is an extra teacher or an extra nurse. If you have some information, or if you are collecting information about that particular extra teacher, if that teacher, how that teacher compares to the other teachers, are they newly educated? Who are these extra nurses? Do they come from school where they didn't like working there, or do they, yeah?
Yeah, I can answer that first. Yeah, so the data we collect in the municipality is sort of data on all school nurses, not only the ones that are hired for this project. And we have this continued dialogue with the municipalities, and many of them come out saying, well, actually it's going to be very hard to recruit school nurses. School nurse is a profession with a sort of speciality in addition to being a regular nurse in Norway, and they're not always available. And then we work with the municipalities to find ways if some of the other tasks of the school nurses can be put away to a regular nurse, allowing a school nurse to work on the sort of psychosocial environment. But that's definitely one of the challenges, to have that intervention which is sort of representative of a regular school nurse. Yeah.
Yeah, so in our case, a lot of schools, well, some schools hired new teachers to go into the position as a 1+1 teacher. But in many schools, they took teachers that were already there and gave them that task. Some teachers wanted to try something new for a while and go into that task, or were specifically interested in mathematics and wanted to see if they could make something of the small group instruction. But of course, you have to deal with the realities of school Norway, where it's not always easy to get a new teacher, and there are huge variations in what type of teachers are brought into the project. And how do we know that? Well, we have questionnaires to teachers. We want the 1+1 teacher to answer what their background is. We can compare that to the background of the other teachers that are part of the project at the school. Are they more qualified? Are they less qualified than the teachers that are already there? How do the teacher qualifications of these new 1+1 schools compare between the comparison schools and the treatment schools? Are we and so all this information in the questionnaire gives us a lot of information about those type of questions. Who are they? What would we? And if they're very qualified, of course, maybe that's what we're picking up, the effect of a qualified teacher and not the small group instruction. And we always have to see this in context. More questions?
Yes, thank you all for great presentations. I'm interested in exploring what kind of institutions we could build in Norway in order to scale up the use of RCTs in Norway. The EEF is a very interesting experience, but in Norway, charities is not a feasible model. I think we don't have charities of that kind in Norway. But since we also have some people from the Research Council in the audience, I think it's interesting to discuss how we could set up a program in Norway having the same functions that the EEF has in the UK. So one question to you first would be why is the Research Council in the UK not involved in this? I didn't hear you mention one single time. It's kind of strange. In Norway, I think a good way of setting up this would be to have a program, which was also actually discussed very briefly here at an earlier seminar in the Research Council, not embracing perhaps only education, but also other kinds of areas like prisons or whatever. And you could have perhaps some kind of program set up where researchers and others could apply to carry out RCTs in the same way as EEF in the UK, and perhaps in Norway it would be natural to have a cooperate with the Education Directorate and perhaps the teachers' unions also, and to have some kind of national collaboration around an experimental program that could fund these kind of RCTs in Norway. So, question first to you, why is the Research Council not mentioned in your presentation? And then afterwards, perhaps some comments from the Research Council in the audience, whether or not such an idea would be feasible in Norway.
So the EEF's funding came from central government. There's a background story that the CEO can tell you about, but effectively they were given an initial endowment of £125 million with a mandate to spend that on producing the best evidence using randomized controlled trials. That's been, money makes money. They've been so successful with this, they've been given more money by other people to carry on doing this work, and they are linking to other foundations, other charities, and the research councils in some respects to kind of talk about these things, but they have really kind of been driving through this change. So it still came effectively from central government, but what they've done with it since has been driven by them. So it really was about where the initial funding came from, but there's not special about that. It could come from somewhere else, philanthropic donation. I don't know, but in terms of the engagement with research councils, yeah, I mean there is a lot of interest in this. One of the key questions you raise is about capacity building to do these kinds of evaluations, and there are, people who are doing randomized controlled trials can come from many different backgrounds, and they run, many universities run training programs, but also conferences on using randomized trials in social policy much more broadly. So one area maybe to think about is evidence-based social intervention, and then that includes all kinds of evidence, not just randomized trials. And that would allow then researchers from any different background to come and think and learn about these kinds of approaches. And it's offering training. NIFU potentially could do that kind of thing as a step towards the capacity building. But it really it could be a very large initial sum, but it also could be built up incrementally over time. Testing out these new ideas, having a go at running these kinds of invitation rounds to say, what are your ideas for education trials, what can we do, and then getting money from research councils or central government to try and do that first step, and if that's successful, then building on that. So I think there are ways of solving the problem. It's just, I think, is a case of engagement with the potential parties involved and talking up the possibilities, because what it means, it's not, there's a change in language from evidence-based government. It's very difficult to say government has to be evidence-based. It could be evidence-informed, though, and this is a good kind of evidence. So maybe that's the dialogue to have with government separately from the research council. So I hope that there's a long and winding answer to a very direct question, but I hope it's of some use.
So is there anyone who feels like answering the second part of the question from Sveinung? Yeah, I can bring you.
I don't know if I can answer your question, but I can try. Well, it's an interesting question as from the Research Council point of view. We see a lot of interest in RCTs from funding ministries, and they keep on asking on this method. But I would say that is it always that we should ask for a particular method? Isn't so that the research question should form the method? So is it like intervention studies could be interesting, and there could be several methods could be used for it. So not only RCTs. So it's like we have to look after them more broad methods for several research questions, I would say. So I would maybe, is it so that we should always ask for RCTs? It could be several other methods using process evaluations, different evaluations. could all answers, is it only RCT that's giving the good questions or the answers for the research questions? I will ask you, the researchers.
Yeah, I see Sveinung wants to answer here, and then Lars. Yeah.
Yeah, just a small comment on that. Of course, RCTs are not always the method to use. It depends on the research question. I completely agree. On the other hand, I think the experiences from carrying out RCTs is that they are too resource demanding, although of course taking the point that compared to scaling up without trying out, it's not, but still it's too resource demanding to fit into a normal research council program. So, and I think the proof is that the Research Council had to set up a separate program in order to carry out 2 projects on teacher density. Having normal programs in the Research Council would not be sufficient, I think, if we want to allow for more RCTs. Still keeping in mind that RCTs is not always the answer, I completely agree, but the institutional setup of the programs that the Research Council has today is not sufficient, not in terms of resources, I think, and perhaps not also in terms of the collaboration between the actors that are needed in order to carry out good RCTs. So I think still there are some good arguments for considering setting up a program like that.
Let me move on here to Lars Kirkebø.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Lars Kirkebø from Statistics Norway. So one thing I've been doing, and this goes back to your question about should we always run RCTs, I think it's interesting to think about the background for the current interest from the ministries in RCTs. And we are these days finalizing the evaluation of New Year, one of the older programs that you mentioned. And there are some challenges also to non-RCT studies. The challenges in general being that they don't work and that we don't learn much from them. And I think the New Year evaluation has been pretty good in making these challenges clear. Still, I think the New Year evaluation is much of an improvement over many previous evaluations, which were largely process evaluations, and they tended to conclude that, yes, people were happy with intervention. And for some reason still the aggregate outcomes never changed much. I think this is really the background. We have been doing lots of stuff. It hasn't worked. Now we're trying something else. And not only that, we're trying something where we can have an ex-ante expectation that it may work and be pretty certain that even if it doesn't work, we still do this in a way that allows us to learn something that we can move forward with. So I think this is very interesting, and to see, well, I've been working mostly with the topic of high school completion, completion of upper secondary, and we have all these old programs. Nobody knows why nothing worked. We have then New Year. Well, we know it didn't work, and we have some ideas of why and how it didn't work. And now we are moving on to RCT programs, funded the same way as NIFU's, or similar to the programs that NIFU are participating in, with the ministry providing money, and then researchers and municipalities, school owners, applying for these monies, given that they have projects and rigorous research designs. So I think this really is the way to move forward. I'm pretty certain you will be managing this. I think that is a decent reading of recent policy documents. I think what may have been a problem in the Norwegian context is that we are thinking a bit too large. It's hard to run small-scale interventions. I don't know why that is the case. One thing may be that these are very hot policy topics. So when we had just a national parliament election, and then exactly how to run intervention in schools, what intervention to run, which students should you target, what kind of which intervention should you have. That's something that you debate in the televised debates just before the elections. So it's there are very many impatient and powerful stakeholders here. when you do have an evaluation, the first question will, can we have any answers by the end of this year?
We know how that feels.
Yeah. So it's kind of hard to do the piloting. Also, Norway is a small country, which may have been influencing that it's hard to do the professional separation that I very much admire of your setup. But I think we are very much moving in this direction, and we will see exactly how we get there and so on. But yeah, we'll like to talk. But
So any other questions? We have some time left. Anyone who wants to follow up? Any comments?
Another suggestion, just think about, so how to involve research councils again, if you want to go down this route. Another thing that is actively pursued is methodological development that research councils, because that's kind of pure research. You know, we're trying to find out the best way of running these evaluations or designing a randomized control trial. So one thing that I've seen is workshops on, for example, something very specific on how to randomize, because often that's something people have to work out for themselves. And having a workshop on that for a day or etc. that's funded by a research council, you invite people to come along to and learn about and actually get them practicing these things and thinking through the problems. That's one way that you can, that's one problem solved, and then you can then move on to something, another trickier problem perhaps. And doing it in that way, like small chunks that are not huge amounts of funding required, but actually allow you to say you're building capacity, that people get involved and meet each other. And also, researchers can drive the impetus and the interest in this because they want to try and do it. Another avenue, by the way, I don't know if this is still happening, but there was the European Social Fund about 4 years ago, it had a call for social experimentation. And I was part of a team that won a grant through that to run an intervention for kids who are at risk of being sent home from school. So that was something that was a European grant, and we got the way that worked. We got the money to run the evaluation. We then approached the EEF to fund the intervention because there wasn't money available for the intervention. So we drove it from that direction as well. So if you have ideas for evaluations and the target group you want to do, that is something to think about. And again, there is much more European-wide interest in this kind of approach now that it's also worth thinking about. I'll stop.
One thing. So in terms of funding, the EEF model, as we explained, has a separate funding mechanism for the intervention and then for the research part, which is the evaluation part. And for the developers or for the intervention aspect, I know that interested developers like the Accelerated Reader Company, for example, when they applied for funding to do this, they had to come up with a certain percentage of funding themselves. So the EEF doesn't actually fund the whole thing, especially if they're for-profit organizations like the Accelerated Reader. There's even more scope to do that. And so by separating those two, let's say NIFU were to apply to do an evaluation, they would actually only be requesting for research funding for the evaluation aspect, so you wouldn't necessarily need to include all of the costs associated with the intervention. That would be borne by some other funding mechanism. It could be that the intervention themselves have to bring in some money. It could be that the school, municipalities, that whoever is, taking part in it. So you can kind of break up how you fund the RCT that way as well between the intervention and the evaluation, therefore bringing down the cost of the research portion of it, which could be funded by the council or research council or something like that. So that's another idea.
More questions? Well, then I think I'll move over here. I think we'll round off then. Yeah, and we have some presents here for you from NIFU. Thank you so much for coming. And I hope we can continue the discussions now after the seminar. I'm sure you all have some questions you'd like to discuss among yourselves about how we can move forward with RCTs. Yeah. So have a nice day. Yeah, thank you.